Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our April virtual presentation given by Steve Rennie. I hope you're all as excited as I am to learn about Ottawa's early baseball history. My name is Sarsat Society of Ottawa, and I'm host tonight. Before we begin, let's take a moment to acknowledge whose land it is that we meet on tonight. For thousands of years before colonial times, the members of Indigenous communities traveled far and wide to gather at the meeting of the three rivers, the Ottawa, the Gatineau, and the Rideau, from the Chaudière Falls to the mouth of the Gatineau River. This area is rich in natural resources, plants, animals, and fish, and it also provides a convenient meeting place for trade and communication among communities. Can you go back, please? Sorry, we weren't that. Of special significance are the burial place at Hull Landing and Chaudière Falls, a sacred place for meeting and sharing in ceremonies. The burial grounds in the Ottawa-Gatineau corridor, including Hull Landing, were important for rituals of respect and bonding with the landscape. Victoria Island, located under the Portage Bridge, continues to provide the sacred space to local and visiting Indigenous people. The National Capital Region, which includes the city of Ottawa, remains unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. We encourage our members and guests to reflect on this, our connected history, and the ways we can contribute to reconciliation. Next slide. Next, we would like to extend our thanks to the City of Ottawa, the Province of Ontario, and last but never least, to our membership. Without your support, none of what the Historical Society of Ottawa does would be possible. In fact, if you would like to become a member of the Historical Society of Ottawa, I will be putting the link to do so in the chat box. We welcome people to become members of the HSO to support our activities, such as today's speaker event, our in-person series, awards for students, and our Bytown pamphlet series. I also wanted to mention that in addition to being regular events director, I also co-edit the HSO blog. If you want to read more about the history of our city, I suggest you check it out. And if you or anyone you know would like to write for our blog, you can also find information to get in touch with us on our website. The HSO has been hosting speaker series events for 127 years now, which means we are all taking part in a very special, long-held tradition here. We have a speaker presentation twice a month, once in person and once virtually. Our in-person events are held here in the auditorium of the main branch of the Ottawa Public, not here, in the main branch of the Ottawa Public Library, starting at 1 p.m. Our virtual events, like tonight, take place usually on the second Wednesday of the month on Zoom at 7 p.m. Our next presentation will happen on April 26th at the main branch of the OPL at 1 p.m. when author Denise Chong will present Through the Lens of the Nonfiction Writer, a search for order in the chaos of real life. Next slide. And this year, we are wrapping up our speaker series with a very special presentation at the OPL at 1 p.m. on Monday, June 16th, when our guest speaker, Ursula Buchan, will tell us all about the life of her grandfather, Governor General John Buchan, who is also known as Lord Tweedsmuir. We hope you will join us there to learn about the life of this extraordinary man. And this brings us to tonight's presentation. Before I introduce Steve, a reminder to everyone to kindly keep your settings on mute so as not to interfere with our speaker's presentation, and to turn off your video feed, which will assist with the overall transmission as well. Tonight's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. So during the presentation, you can start typing your questions into the chat box, and I'll get to post them to Steve afterwards. And now it is my honor to introduce Steve Rennie. Steve Rennie is a baseball writer and researcher living in Ottawa. He co-edited and contributed to the recently published book, From Bytown to the Big Leagues, 150 Years of America's Pastime in Canada's Capital. Steve's research has also taken him to the Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York, where he presented on Ottawa's early baseball history last year. He will be returning to Cooperstown this month to share his findings on early baseball in the far north and during the Klondike Gold Rush, the topic of his next book, due out in the spring of 2027. Steve, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to the Historical Society of Ottawa for the opportunity to be here tonight. Really excited to be able to share a bit of Ottawa's baseball history with everybody here. So I'll just jump right in. One of the things about Ottawa baseball history is that people may not realize it's actually been, the game has been here quite a lot longer than many people realize, going back to at least 1865, but I think probably longer than that. And one of the reasons it's often overlooked is because baseball has a very deep history in Canada, particularly in Southern Ontario. And so that sort of overshadows Ottawa. But I think Ottawa has a really important history that is worthy of being covered, and that's what I'm hoping to talk about tonight. So before we get going, I just want to set a bit of the stage for how baseball started to develop, and walk through, and that'll help situate what I'm about to talk about. So if we start in 1838, this is what is considered the first recorded game of baseball in Canada, played in the town of Beachville, Ontario. We know about this because close to 50 years later, after the fact, a gentleman named Adam Ford had written a letter with an account of this game in quite a lot of vivid detail. So, the measurements of the field, really high level of detail about who played in the game. So really, really specific letter. And so, some consider this to be, Canada's first recorded baseball game, although there may have been others. And there's been some research into that area. In 1839, this is the debunked myth of Abner Doubleday inventing baseball in Cooperstown. This was a story that was created in 1905 by a gentleman named Abner Graves. And just to give a bit of background there, at that time, there was a commission that was struck to study the baseball's origins in the United States, and really trying to establish that the game was American in its origins. And as part of that commission's work, they used a letter from a gentleman named Abner Graves, who had written about how he, as a young boy, had been in Cooperstown, New York in 1839, and Abner Doubleday, who had been a teenager at that point, invented baseball on the spot, sort of drew out the dimensions of the field and the rules of the game, sort of defies belief. And of course, it's completely fictitious. Abner Doubleday and his family were not even living in Cooperstown at the time. And he didn't invent baseball, I think we can confidently say, in 1839. But it wasn't long after that the Knickerbocker Club of New York adopted a set of rules that were published, and that really started this movement towards baseball becoming a very popular sport in the United States and Canada. And by the 1850s, particularly in the New York metropolitan area, baseball was extremely a popular sport. It doesn't take long, though, before the game starts to come to Canada. And we have an international game here played in 1860 between the Queen City Club of Buffalo and the Burlington Club of Hamilton. And what we'll see later is that this game took place only a few weeks before another international game closer to home, closer to Ottawa, between Prescott and Ogdensburg. In 1869, the Cincinnati Red Stockings are considered to be the first openly professional club. And then in 1871, professional baseball is really established with the National Association of Professional Baseball Players. So that just helps give a bit of a timeline of where we are in this presentation. Now, to talk about baseball, you've got to talk about the rail lines. One of the ways that baseball spread in the United States and Canada was through the railways. And in Ottawa, we began getting rail transit in the 1850s. And that created a line between Prescott and Bytown at the time, later Ottawa. And then you can see here on the screen, I've got a typical advertisement that you would have seen there that basically shows what the schedule would have been like for leaving Ottawa. So you would stop in places like at Kempville and other little towns along the way. So if you left at Ottawa at 6 a.m., you could be in Prescott by 9. So that wasn't too bad considering the alternative would have been quite a lot longer. Once you got to Prescott, it was just a short ferry ride over and into Ogdensburg, and then you could hop on the rail line there and you could head out east to Montreal or to Boston or New York or other places. So really opened up a lot of transportation in the Ottawa area. Now, I mentioned earlier upstate New York. Baseball was really popular in the 1850s and 1860s and onwards in this area. And we see a really early account of a baseball game played between it says the newspaper here calls them the Greenville Club of Prescott. I think that likely is supposed to be Grenville, just because it would have been maybe Leeds and Grenville. So I think that was probably what they meant to say, but it's listed in the newspaper as Greenville. And they played the Ogdensburg team and won in a 3-inning game, which is unusual, by a score of 23-16. But this game takes place only a matter of weeks after that first recognized game between a Canadian and an American team. So we do see already that in this part of Canada, baseball is already crossing borders, and it's already starting to develop a bit of a history. Now, in terms of Ottawa, the first documented game I was able to come across took place at a fair in Metcalfe, just outside, then outside the city, now part of the city, on September the 13th, 1865. And there was a write-up describing all the events that took place at that fair, and one of them included some sporting events. So you see cricket and baseball, sack racing, wheelbarrow, hurdle, et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting to me about this article is that it is just assumed that the reader knows what baseball is. It's not, which tells me that people were playing it. They would have had to have known what the game was to participate in the game in the fair, and for a reader to just instantly know what baseball was. So there assumes some familiarity with the sport, which suggests to me that people here were already playing it before 1865. So this is it's an interesting sort of marker in Ottawa's baseball history because it signals that this is right around the time where the sport is starting to take root here. The paper does also go on to mention that there was a game of ball played by some of the women who were at the event, but it's unclear if that was baseball or some other game altogether. We had our first real baseball club form in 1867, and they were called the New Dominion Club of Ottawa, and they took their name from what was then the newly formed Dominion of Canada. They're significant because they are really the first big club that our city had. And, by the following year, their membership had swelled to about 60 people. It would have been the largest and maybe the only club in the city at that time. But in 1867, they, shortly after forming, decided to travel to Ogdensburg and play a game against the team there. And as you can see in the write-up from the newspaper, they didn't fare very well. They lost by a score of 141-20. Maybe I'll pause here too to just note that at this period of time in history of baseball, you see a lot of these really high scores. So 141-20 is particularly high, but you do often see these very high scores. And that was largely because the role of the pitcher at that point wasn't to try to strike out the batter. It was kind of like when you play with your kid and you're lobbing them the ball, hoping they hit it. It was very much like that. So this sort of underhanded lobbing. The batters didn't have to swing if they didn't want to, so they could wait for a pitch that they liked. And the fielders didn't have gloves, and so catching a fly ball was not an appealing prospect. So you have these really, really high scores. And so in Ottawa's case, they lose this game in 1867. And you can see the newspapers kind of hinting too that they didn't really have a great familiarity with the rules of the game. They are, outclassed by the the Ogdensburg team. The paper does mention that they do seem to be like they're good athletes, and if they had more practice and more familiarity with the game, they'll probably do better next year. They also established a clubhouse. So they met at the Ottawa Skating and Curling Club, which is would have been right behind sort of on Albert Street. And they had their clubhouse there, and they played in the field right behind. The next year, baseball really starts to explode, 1868. So now it's really taking off, and it's largely because of the New Dominion Club. And so they're looking for people to play. And so in a lot of cases, they end up playing themselves. They sort of split their team, and they'll have one half of the team play another half of the team. They play a group of mechanics. They get into a 4-game series with the local cricket club. And so the way that worked was 2 of the games were baseball and 2 of the games were cricket. And predictably, they did well in the baseball games, not as well in the cricket matches. They also played Ogdensburg 2 more times, and so the first time they played them, it was actually pretty close. They were actually ahead for quite a while, but then they lost, I think, by a few runs. So it was they were pretty happy about that because Ogdensburg had been an established team and had done really well. So to be that close with a team that was that good was an accomplishment. They were more disappointed the third time they played them when they didn't fare quite as well. But regardless, they still had a good time at that period of time as well. The baseball was a big part of the day, but it wasn't the only part of the day. What they tended to do after the games were to go for a dinner where they'd give speeches and they'd sing songs and they'd do toasts and all sorts of things like that. So the party was as much of the of the spectacle as the game itself. So what happened to the New Dominion Club? They didn't last very long. After the 1868 season, they pretty much just disappeared. And there's a brief mention of them the following year, but after that, there's nothing. And it was a few years later before we found out what happened. I'll get to that in a second. In the interim, though, after the New Dominion Club went away, another club called the Ottawa Baseball Club formed, made up of a number of players from the New Dominion Club. And so in 1871, this letter appears in the paper, and they're talking about the New Dominion Club, and they kind of reveal that what happened was their clubhouse and their field they played on was sold and subdivided for lots, and so they had no place to play, and that was it. So that's why they went out of business. They weren't able to play anymore. They had no place to play. So that was the end of the New Dominion Club. They also talked about their games against Ogdensburg, and then they gave a bit of context around that. So weren't around for a long time, but they were a really significant part of the city's baseball history. Now, the city's first stadium or ballpark, ballpark is probably a better way to describe it. In 1872, the Ottawa Baseball Club that I was just speaking about leased some land in what was called Stewarton at the time, which was its own village separate from the city of Ottawa on the sort of southern edge of, I guess it would have been sort of Gladstone in that area. So a little bit further south of that. Excuse me for a second. It was separate from the city of Ottawa. And it was sort of it stretched basically past the canal to the east, and then the west past Bronson, and then further south. So it was almost a sort of I don't know what you call it, like maybe a suburb, I suppose, of the city. And it was named after William Stewart, who was a landowner in the area. And many of the streets that you see there were actually named after his children. So you've got McLeod and Flora, Isabella, Florence, Ann Street, which became Gladstone, John Street, which became Cartier. Park Avenue is there, where Flora Street used to be. And so they built this large ballpark in that area because it was the only sort of land available. Everything else had been developed. The reason they did that was because they had a big game coming up, but I'll talk about that in a second. But first, I'll just show you sort of where it is today. So you can see here, sort of in this area of Gladstone, Cartier, down towards the canal. It's all houses now, if you go down there. The residential neighborhood, but at the time, that's where the ballpark was. And they built it because the Boston Red Stockings were coming to town in 1872. So the Boston Red Stockings were the most famous team in the entire world. They had all-star players, future Hall of Famers on the team. Really, really important club. And they barnstormed, so they would travel around to Canadian and American cities, and they would play local teams. And it was a way for them to sort of raise money. And so that's what they did. They came to Ottawa in 1872, and it was a way for them to sort of raise some more money. So they played the Ottawa Baseball Club, and it was a really big deal. So the day was set aside for a civic holiday. So the city was declared it a holiday. In the morning, a team of English cricketers, gentlemen cricketers, had come to Rideau Hall, and they played there. And then in the afternoon, the Red Stockings came down to the new ballpark, and they played the Ottawa Baseball Club. So if you can imagine it, it would be sort of like, if the Boston Red Sox of today came and played your local beer league team. So they lost the first one. The Red Stockings liked Ottawa, though. They were really impressed with the stadium. They thought that they had a really good reception in Ottawa, and so they came back the next year, and Ottawa did a little bit better. They won. They lost 44-4, but they at least scored 4 runs. Now the paper was really impressed with a player named George Latham, who played for Ottawa, and they said basically he was basically as good as anybody who played on the Boston side. And so Latham actually had a cup of coffee with Boston a few years later, bounced around a few other leagues, and but he really did put on quite a showing there, and really impressed the Red Stockings when he was in that Ottawa game. Our first homegrown player to play in the big leagues was a man named Jack Humphreys. He was born in North Gore in 1861. His family only lived here for about 5 years, so we have a very tenuous hold on Jack Humphreys, but nevertheless, he was born in the area. He played for a few teams like the Gothams and the Washington Nationals. And notably, in 1883, he and a gentleman named James O'Neill became the first Canadian-born battery. So that would be the first Canadian-born pitcher and catcher in the same game. And then he went on to manage several other teams that I've listed here. And his eldest son ended up writing a poem in which he references his father. So that's Jack Humphreys. So where did they play? That's one of the interesting things about baseball history in the city is you see how the city develops and grows. In the 1800s, there wasn't a lot of room to build these big ballparks. They take up a lot of space. So people would play, if you had a sort of a more established team, you'd play in certain places. Kids often played in the streets. So you'd get these newspaper reports of, in Sandy Hill and Lower Town and different parts of the city of these games taking place. And it's interesting too, because you would get these newspaper articles about people complaining about the noise, or people complaining that baseball was happening on Sundays, which would have been their Sabbath day. So, it was just showing the popularity of the sport. Cartier Square is, has a long military association in the city. The Cartier Square drill hall was where the soldiers would do their drills, and it's sort of where right now, if you go down to City Hall, the front lawn of City Hall would have been a big lawn, and so a lot of the drills would have been there. It was a really appealing piece of real estate, though, because it's basically this big field pretty close to downtown. And so it was often kind of eyed for baseball. One of the interesting things about it, though, was because it was owned by the Department of Militia and Defense, anybody who wanted to play there used to have to write and ask for written permission to play baseball there. And so if you go down to Library and Archives, as I did, you will find many, many letters from teams that have asked permission to play baseball. So I'll just go through some of them. So here you can see from 1872, the Victoria Baseball Club had written to the Minister of Militia and Defense, and they have asked if it would be okay if they were to play on the parade grounds, as long as we don't get in the way of the soldiers, and then get a reply back saying, yes, that's completely fine. You see here the Celtic Benefit Association, same thing, wrote a letter asking for permission to play, gets the letter back. And then my perhaps favorite name, the Eclipse Office Furniture Baseball Club, wrote a letter in 1899, respectfully asking to be permission to play at Cartier Square. And then they get a reply saying, yes, that's completely fine as well. There are many, many more of these letters, but this I found interesting that they had to go through this process in which to play a game there. The Metropolitan Grounds were another place where baseball was played. This was an area on Jane Street, which is now Pretoria Avenue, between O'Connor and Metcalfe, downtown. And it was at one point controlled by the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club, who I'll talk about in a second. And so beyond the baseball diamond, they had a clay track for bicycle races. And so it was a big sporting facility. The short-lived Ottawa Senators baseball team, who I'll talk about in a bit, played there, and the Ottawa Rough Riders football team did as well. And it was sold off in 1900 and then turned into some of those lots that you see now in the glebe. So I mentioned them a second ago, the Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club. So this was sort of the umbrella organization for different sports teams in the city. And it was really aimed at sort of promoting physical and physical activity and camaraderie, and it was a social club as well. It was open mostly to men. Women could join the club as well, but with far fewer privileges. And it really kind of catered to the city's elite. So you could become a life member of this association, but you had to pay $100 in which to do so, which was quite a lot of money at the time. Or you could just pay a lesser amount per year. So I think it was $10 a year or $2 a month, something like that. Still a significant amount of money. Their clubhouse was at the corner of Elgin and Maria Street at the time, now Laurier Avenue. And one of the most notable things about them is that they were one of the first sporting groups to use the red, white, and black color scheme that you often see now with Ottawa sports teams. So the Senators and the Red Blacks now, and the Rough Riders back in the day, and even the current Frontier League team, the Titans. The red, white, and black are typically associated with Ottawa. And this Ottawa Amateur Athletic Club was one of the first to do that. In their handbook, they actually spell out those are the official club colors. So we get to 1898. Baseball's very popular in Ottawa, but we have not had a professional baseball team. We had lots of amateur teams who played each other. So you'd see often in the newspaper, there'd be reports of games between usually occupations. So like one workplace would play another workplace, or a team of mechanics would play a team of blacksmiths or things like that. Sometimes you'd have inter-town teams. So a team from Ottawa would play a team from Merrickville, or a team from Prescott, or even over in Quebec, they'd play teams from Thurso and then other places. But we didn't have a professional club. And so in the summer of 1898, the Ottawa Citizen started a campaign to bring professional baseball to Ottawa. And the argument was as much a sporting argument as it was an economic argument. And they said, if Ottawa is as big, or if not bigger, a city than many of the teams that have professional baseball teams, and if some of these other cities were to come to Ottawa, it might spur investment in the city. It might spur interest in the city, which would help the city continue to grow and develop. And this got the attention of a number of people, influential people, including the mayor, Samuel Bingham, who had admitted at the time he knew very little about baseball, but he was very intrigued by the possibility of potentially having this team as a bit of a way to promote the city. And so over the course of June and July, the Citizen publishes a series of articles advocating for a baseball team to be brought to Ottawa. Now, this timing was great because the Rochester franchise was struggling. So Rochester had a team that was really, really having a tough time. And relocation was a very serious possibility. It was that or basically close the team. They were losing money, and it wasn't going to work in Rochester. And so a number of cities were considered, including Ottawa. And the league eventually decided that they would grant Ottawa a team. And so midway through July of 1898, the Rochester players are told after a game that basically, go home, pack your stuff, and you're going to Ottawa. That's where the team is now. And so they take a ferry over from Ogdensburg and the train up, and they're met at the station by many people, and it's a big deal. And Ottawa's very, very, very excited about the possibility about now having a professional baseball team playing in the Eastern League. And so that's how professional baseball came to Ottawa. They played their first they played their first two games at Lansdowne Park, and really enthusiastic crowd. People are really excited to see them. Both games they played against Syracuse. Both games they lost. The first one pretty badly. The second one not as bad. After that, though, they had to move to the Metropolitan Grounds that I talked about a bit earlier. And that's because the cricket club actually held the lease to Lansdowne Park. And the games were conflicting with the cricket team, so they weren't able to use it. So after that, they moved to the Metropolitan Grounds. Now, the only thing is they couldn't play games in Ottawa on Sundays. And so they had to play over in Hull on Sundays because the blue laws in Ontario meant that they weren't able to do any kind of sporting events or activities on Sundays. They didn't have a great season, but it wasn't terrible. Until about late August, they won as many games as they lost, hovering around that 500 record. But enthusiasm really started to wane. When the team's not having a lot of success on the field, people are not coming out. They're not enjoying the game as much. And the team is losing a lot of money. The owners are writing and telling the newspaper that, if they don't start getting more people coming to the games, they might have to even fold up before the season's over. And so it's not looking good. They finish with a losing record, so 53-70 record. And it's reported that the team has lost, in the span of 6 weeks, they've lost $4,000, which was just an astronomical amount of money to lose in such a short amount of time back then. And so the team is disbanded, and that's it. The team doesn't, we don't get a professional team again until several years later. One thing about this team, if you look online, you may see that they're called the Ottawa Wanderers or just the Wanderers. And that's just not right. The team was frequently referred to in the newspapers as the Senators. It started actually with a Toronto sports writer who said that, the Washington team had a Senators, the Washington team was known as the Senators. And wouldn't it be great if the team in our capital was also called the Senators? And the Ottawa sports writers picked that up and started referring to the team in all their copy as the Senators. So you'd see reports from games where they say, the Senators played some great ball today, or the Senators are doing this or that. So it's very clearly that this team was known as the Senators. Wanderers was a team that was often used for hockey clubs that moved around from city to city. Even if they had an official nickname, sometimes they would, kind of be referred to as Wanderers, sort of informally. And so that's perhaps how this Ottawa Wanderers name stuck, because the Rochester team had relocated here. But that's just speculation. But it was very clear from the research that I did that they were actually, in fact, called the Senators. Ottawa is a city of politics, and so in 1885, a series of these cards portrayed a number of well-known politicians in different stages of play here. Some depicted a little less flatteringly than others. You can see Sir John A. Macdonald getting bopped on the nose there with a bat, and a few other players, a few other politicians playing the game. Tommy Gorman is another important figure in Ottawa sports history, mostly known for hockey. He was a general manager, won a number of Stanley Cups with a number of teams. He was one of the founders of the National Hockey League. He's in the Hockey Hall of Fame. But before all that, he played on the House of Commons Pages baseball team. So you can see that picture I've got there on the right-hand side. He's one of the players played for them. So there's no real. He also had some involvement in bringing the the another franchise also called the Senators to Ottawa a little bit later. But really more known for hockey. But interestingly, you have this picture of him as a young a boy there playing baseball. And that's it. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and yeah, happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
I have questions. Can you hear me,
so
Steve?
much. Thank you
I
much,
can.
Steve, for that fantastic presentation. If anyone has questions, they can.
Yeah, Sherry, it's James Powell here. I have a
hi,
question.
James.
Hi. Steve, there's a lot of sports being played back in those days. There's, besides baseball, there's lacrosse and summer sports, lacrosse, football, cricket. Where did baseball fit in the sort of the general overall popularity of the sports? Because people didn't have a whole lot of time to play or to go out and watch games.
Yeah, that's really the remarkable thing, right? Because a lot of the people who are playing these baseball teams were not sort of well-off people who would clock at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock and then go play baseball. They were working very, very long days and still found time for it, which is sort of, it illustrates, their level of commitment to the game. In terms of where it sort of ranked, though, there were debates in the newspapers back in the 1870s and 80s about was it lacrosse or baseball or cricket or baseball, and they're always sort of comparing these sports to each other. Baseball seemed to be the one that got the most attention from the 1870s to about the 1890s. Hockey wasn't really around in the 1870s, so baseball was at that point, I would argue, the most popular summer sport in the city. Based on what I've been able to find.
Right. Thanks.
That's an interesting observation about the sport being a working class sport, because that's the reputation that baseball has had for many decades in the U.S. Whether it's still a working class sport is a bit up for debate because of ticket prices. But your book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. It's a great presentation tonight. Joins the ranks of other sports books in the city. For example, Paul Kitchen wrote a wonderful book about the beginning of the hockey in the Ottawa Senators. And of course, Stephen Harper wrote The Great Game, a book about hockey from the Toronto point of view. And in Stephen Harper's book, he talks quite a bit about the struggle between professional and amateur sports, which today we think of something it's virtuous if it's an amateur sport. But back then, the way he made the case, calling something an amateur sport was a way of keeping the working class out. Because there was no payment, a lot of working class people couldn't participate. But it sounds like baseball would have been a working class alternative for those folks.
Yeah, and baseball really was interesting because it was an amateur sport until 1871. There were no professional teams, there was the Red Stockings a little later, and there was probably other teams before that as well that were paying players, and maybe it just wasn't as widely publicized. The Red Stockings made no bones about the fact that they're paying their players, and then that led to established professional leagues, which then now players are getting paid, and the games are being organized, and you've got leagues, and it's much more of a serious thing. But before that, it's very much sort of a challenge system almost, where you've got group of players, could be friends, could be colleagues, coworkers. They're playing against other people. It's very much like, if you go down to Brewer Park or Hampton Park or any of these places, and you've got these local teams playing each other. It was very much in that spirit. And yeah, very much in the, you've got these people who, it's astounding that they were able to find the time to play baseball, given that they were working, again, these incredibly long days, often 6 days a week, 7 days a week, and yet would still find the time to play baseball. So yeah, it really does sort of say a lot about sort of who was playing the sport back then.
I'll just remind everybody that if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box, and we'll be glad to ask your questions of Steve. So this, what you're saying kind of relates to something else, because we know that you mentioned Rideau Hall. Rideau Hall lent great support to hockey, and then football. We had Lord Stanley and Lord Grey, Earl Grey, both donate cups to those two sports. Why not baseball? What happened there? Or was there something?
Well, they played baseball on the grounds of Rideau Hall, so there's accounts of amateur teams playing there. But because we didn't really have we had various city leagues that would come, and they'd only be around for a year or two. So you'd see these reports of, and they went by different names, but they would form, and they'd add a team, take away a team, and then next year they were gone, and another league would form, and another league would form. And so it's really hard to have any kind of continuity when you've got these, leagues, and sometimes competing leagues. You may have two leagues starting up in the city at the same time, and then how do you choose which one that you're going to, have a cup for? And because Ottawa wasn't involved in any professional sports at the time, and there was, we weren't really, or no, professional baseball at the time, rather, it was a little hard to bestow a cup or any kind of trophy on these people. So yeah, but in terms of just as a place where they played, it was certainly there, but it wasn't really. It didn't have the organization that I think would lend itself to coming up with a cup or any sort of championship to play for.
We have another question that's come in, Steve. Somebody asking how different the rules would have been back then compared to today. They didn't have the designated hitter, I'm assuming.
Yeah, no designated hitter. And so a few different rules. You could catch the ball, like it was allowed to bounce once on a fly ball, and the person would be out if you got it on the bounce. So one bounce. And that was largely because you didn't have a glove. And so I think it's a lot to expect somebody to catch one of these fly balls with their hands. As it were, their fingers were often sort of mangled and quite in bad shape. And then, as I mentioned with the pitchers, earlier, they had to throw underhand, and they couldn't flick their wrist. So there was a very specific way you had to throw the ball, and it was really meant to give the pitcher as many chances as they wanted to find a pitch they liked that they could swing at. Strikes came later, and so you didn't have to swing, and you could just sit there, for dozens and dozens of pitches if you wanted to. Eventually, the umpire would, call a strike and try to prompt the game along. But it could be a terribly boring game in that way, because you would just, there's no action. It's essentially just the pitcher lobbing the ball, the catcher catching it and throwing it back, and that would repeat itself over and over. So could be quite boring. Catchers wouldn't have had masks early on, and so those are some of the rules back then. But it was a pretty dangerous sport in some sense. Like you would come across these articles every now and then of players dying because they would hit by the ball or whatever it might be. Every now and then you see these sort of hysterical articles coming out about people complaining that baseball is a very dangerous sport, and it's leading to all these deaths. I see the other question here is same number of positions.
Mm-hmm.
And James, I think you had another question.
Well, I'm just wondering what was the a ticket price to one of the Ottawa games? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, for the when the professional team came to town, it was what is it? Let me just check it. I think I got the score. Just check my notes here, because I do have this the cost of the games. I think it was 25 cents or 50 if you wanted to sit in the grandstands. That was the cost to go to a game. One of the two games at Lansdowne, and I imagine the prices would have been sort of in line with that afterwards.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, James.
No, that's sort of in line with going to the Russell Theatre at the time, so for a ticket to see a play. And just also another question: was there any baseball cards? I know the first series of baseball cards of the Boston Red Stockings. Like I remember seeing on Antiques Roadshow, some little old lady came in with this set of cards that was worth like $1 million. Were any Ottawa baseball players featured on baseball cards?
If they were, the only one I could think of would be George Latham, just because he did play very briefly for the Red Stockings in the 1870s. But I actually don't know if there's a card of him. But of all the Ottawa people who would have passed through Ottawa, he's the only one I could think that would have had a card. The city itself, I've not come across any baseball cards of any of the players that we had in the city. Even photographs are surprisingly difficult to find from that period. There just wasn't many taken, and certainly not too many of baseball games. The ones you would typically see would be some of those posed pictures that I had in the presentation, where a little later on you'd have teams that would sit for a picture after they'd won maybe their local league championship or something like that. But no sort of action shots like you would see today. Just the technology didn't lend itself to that. And it was very expensive as well. So, you didn't necessarily want to go out to every local baseball game and take pictures. But yeah, I've not seen any. I have not seen any baseball cards from that period.
One of the things I've noticed about sports history in Ottawa and elsewhere was the evolution. For example, the football teams we have today, and I'm referring to North American football, seem to have evolved from the rugby team. So you had a rugby club and they became the football club, and you had a lacrosse club who became the hockey club. Did baseball evolve from another sport? Was there a connection with cricket, or?
It's an interesting question, because you do see in other cities where they had a sporting club that may have had cricket as one of the sports they played, would also then have an offshoot group that would play baseball. That didn't seem to happen in Ottawa. I wonder if it's because maybe it came a little bit later to Ottawa than it did some of the American cities. And so they just decided to form a baseball club versus, or they already had an established cricket club, which we did. And so maybe they just decided to form a separate entity and just play baseball. There are people who say it kind of grew out of things like rounders or other sports. And there's lots of different opinions on that. You can read people like David Block or Thomas Gilbert or John Thorne, and they'll very voraciously argue that it did not actually evolve from rounders. Rounders was its own separate sport, and baseball was a separate sport, and perhaps they share a distant ancestor somewhere. But it wasn't like baseball grew out of rounders, which was sort of the common. It's something that's lots of people still think that. I happen to think that it evolved separately, and rounders was its own thing, and baseball was its own thing.
Sherry?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about if there was any fallout after the Senators baseball team got disbanded, because it sounds pretty significant that the Ottawa Citizen had a months-long campaign to get professional baseball, and they argued that it would be an economic benefit, and then it was I guess you could say in a way is an economic detriment considering the money the team lost, and if there was any backlash to that, or if it had an effect on the amateur clubs in Ottawa as well.
It certainly had an economic impact on the owners who lost quite a bit of money on the team. And I think the fact that we didn't get professional baseball for another number of years maybe scared people off from trying it again. It's interesting about the Citizen because they kind of turned on the team at one point. So by August, they weren't such boosters of the team anymore. They were kind of mocking them in the newspaper after losses. There was I think in the pamphlet in the book, I found one where they kind of sort of cheekily say, like, all's forgiven, it's okay, suggesting that you're a terrible team, but we'll live with you. I think the most notable thing about that team, though, was the uniforms. So I didn't really touch on that too much in the presentation, but you could see the picture of them wearing those tartan uniforms. That came about because when they came from Rochester, they were still wearing the blue and white Rochester uniforms that they would have had then. But that first game they played at Lansdowne, for reasons that I don't fully understand, the lettering on the uniforms was in different states. So some players it was like kind of a mishmash of lettering depending on which player you're looking at. Some might have had the word Roche, some might have had the word Chester, some might have had some combination of those. Some letters are missing, some were peeling off. And so they didn't look like a professional baseball team. They looked very much like a team that had just found these uniforms in a bin somewhere. And so a local tailor on Spark Street kind of took it upon himself, probably for publicity more than anything, to create these uniforms for them. And he came up with these tartan uniforms that I suspect were, they're mentioned in the newspaper as being sort of red and white and gray and black. So again, sort of that color scheme that we're familiar with here in Ottawa. And the Citizen was still on side at that time. They were very much boosters. They, very much in praise of the uniforms, talking about how sharp they looked and just what, how the other teams in the league must be in such envy of Ottawa for having these beautiful, beautiful uniforms. And it's quite a different story if you read any other city's account of the uniforms. Montreal is ruthless and just mocks them very savagely, and all the other cities in the Eastern League, there's different write-ups that sometimes saying, sort of gentle things where it's, a bit of an eyesore, to, people saying they're the most abominable uniforms, or the, really, really horrendous outfits. So all that to say, I think that, yes, the financial loss was significant. I think that if anything, this team will be remembered just as perhaps the only one that has worn a tartan outfit like that. And actually, if you go to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, that picture is in there. You can see it there of this Ottawa team. So it left a mark. I mean, if it was enough for the Hall of Fame to put up at the museum, I think that's that's something.
Before Sherry wraps up, I just want to ask a question. Well, first of all, I want to mention to everybody that you've written a great pamphlet for us, which is available online on our website. And I'm looking forward to getting a copy of your book. And how do we get a copy? What's the best way to get a copy of your book?
So you can go to any of the typical book sellers, so Amazon, Chapters. You can go also order directly from the publisher. So if you go to the Society for American Baseball Research, SABR, you can order it straight from them. And if you don't want to buy it, but you want to read it, you can go down to the Ottawa Library. It's available there as well. Hope you read it. It was a great effort, because it wasn't just me who wrote it. I was one of the editors of the book, and I wrote a number of chapters, but it really was a great collaboration with a number of local baseball historians, a number of former journalists, and everybody just sort of looking into different aspects of Ottawa baseball. And I found it really interesting, because my interest is the sort of the earlier period, that period in the 1800s, as well as a bit more on the Lynx side. But I learned a lot about baseball and in between those two bookends, which I didn't have as much familiarity with going into the book. So even if you don't like baseball, I think it'll tell you a lot about how the city has grown over time and some of the more significant developments that we've had. And baseball is a bit of a backdrop to all that.
Awesome. I just want to say thank you to Steve for a wonderful presentation. I think we all learned a lot about the history of baseball in Ottawa, but also about the history of Ottawa itself, which was very interesting. I'd like to thank Jacob for all your help tonight.
Thanks.
And thank you to Ben for helping me out with this Q&A. And thank you all for coming and joining us tonight. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.